Progressives need to re-embrace the word nationalize and the local versions of it. Local communities taking over, for example, their cable TV and internet systems. Check this out. Leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Thom Hartmann here with you, and on the line with us is Ross Lukas. He's a senior policy analyst with Friends of the Earth. FOE.org is their website. You can tweet him at Lukas Ross, Lukas Ross, number 1. Ross, welcome to the program.
It's great to be here, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. So the big big oil bailout, we just saw a giant bailout of the airline industry and the banking industry and the insurance industries and pretty much any other industry that's got, a good connection into the Trump administration. You've got $500 billion, $500 billion that's specifically earmarked to give away to these, whoever Donald Trump wants to decide to give it to. And then on top of that, there was $500 million in funding to backstop the Fed so that the Fed could loan out an additional $4 trillion. Has Friends of the Earth figured out if, how, or when the oil industry is going to get their grubby little hands into this?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much clear that if there is anyone who's going to be lining up around the block to get some of this corporate slush fund money, it's going to be big oil. The thing you've got to understand is that this industry was not in very good financial health before the coronavirus. And it is now working very hard to exploit this crisis to get a lifeline for itself.
So how exactly are they doing that? What are they doing?
So I think what you've got to understand is that as a result of the stimulus, we're all entering an even stranger and more frightening world than before. Yes, direct aid is headed to individuals eventually, but Steve Mnuchin is now perhaps the most powerful man in Washington. He has really unprecedented discretion over how this $500 billion slush fund is spent. And one of the things that we're seeing is that any kind of guardrails that are associated with this money are actually not very binding. He has the authority to waive most of the restrictions on limiting stock buybacks and just overall determining how this money is spent. There just aren't very many guardrails for workers or communities, and there are no guardrails at all for climate. And when you have the fossil fuel industry, which was actually bleeding red ink long before any of this started, you kind of have a perfect storm. What's going to happen is that these companies that have been heavily involved in fracking, they've been producing a lot of oil and gas, but they haven't really been producing a lot of money. The fundamentals are pretty weak to anyone who's bothered to look. And as a result of that, it seems very likely that these debt-strapped companies that are going to have trouble getting access to credit normally, who had cash flow problems before this, are just basically going to jump in and take advantage of this huge slush fund that's been made available to the general economy now. And because of their connections to the Trump administration, you can be pretty sure that they're going to be first online.
Ross, about a year ago, I had an oil analyst guy on this show, or somebody who deals with oil analysts, and he suggested that the fracking industry, by and large, is following the same economic model that over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, has been played out in the coal mining industry, and that is basically what's been happening. I think we saw this with Massey. I could be wrong, but I believe that was probably one of the poster child examples of this. Is that they create a mine, they whether it's an open pit or whatever, they destroy the environment, they create millions and millions of dollars of toxic legacy. They set up a disposable corporation to own all that. They borrow as much money against that corporation as they possibly can. They max out its line of credit, and so that they can pay large amounts of money out of that debt to their stockholders and to their CEOs and senior executives. And then when the end of the mine, the exhaustion of the mine, or the reduction in demand is within sight, and they would have to, under the existing laws, start cleaning up the mine, at that point they bankrupt it and dump the liability on the people. And this guy suggested that fracking is is really, a fracked well typically has a 5 to 15 year maximum lifespan, 5-year average. And that these companies are loading up on debt mostly so that they can shift the money from that debt to their CEOs. And there's literally hundreds of these small private corporations fracking around the United States. And the reason there's so many of them, there's not been an effort to consolidate them all, is because all of them are running on this plan of we're going to frack, we're going to take all the gas or oil out we can and sell it. We're going to put that money in our pockets. And when it comes time to do remediation, to fix the environmental damage as the well is winding down, we're simply going to declare bankruptcy and walk away. Is that what's going on here, or a variation on that?
Yeah, I think that the story of fracking is, in a lot of respects, a really American story. It's a scam. We have like a little bit of, financial, a little bit of financial magic here, making it look like something is a good investment. And at a certain point, the people on the ground floor are going to walk away and try to take as much money with them as possible. This is not really a new story here. And I think that what you're outlining right now is really underlines the fact that one word that progressives can't afford to fear right now is nationalization. These companies are probably going to be trying to get a hold of as much money from us as possible right now. So one of the things that means is that we actually need to draw a pretty sharp line about what the conditions for any fossil fuel company receiving aid should look like. And I think that needs to be a phase out of fossil fuel production and an ironclad commitment to resolving existing environmental liabilities and existing pension obligations. If they want any money, they cannot be allowed to walk away from the mess they've created.
Right. Well, prior to Reagan, pension funds were sacred. They had to be booked as liabilities rather than assets. Reagan changed that so you could book them as assets, and then you could basically steal the pension funds when you bankrupt the companies, which has been standard business practice since Carl Icahn pioneered it with TWA back in the 70s, I think it was, or the 80s. No, it was the 80s. But to what extent is this how is this practicable? I mean, how do we do this given how institutionalized this business model is? The Fed, for example, about a week and a half ago, the Fed said, and I read the Financial Times, I didn't read it anywhere else. The Fed said, we're going to start buying corporate bonds. Yep. Now, I'm assuming that they're buying fracking company bonds. These are bonds that if they were left in the marketplace would be blowing up right now. They'd be exploding, and these companies would have it be, they'd be called. There'd be all these calls on them, and they'd be going out of business. But if the Fed buys the bonds, then you and I, they're nationalizing basically the liability. We're paying for that, and the exploding bonds are invisible. And that is what, according to the Financial Times article that I read, that's what has kicked the stock market back up and put a floor underneath it. In fact, the Fed has even said that they will start buying stocks if necessary, and they may already be doing this. So how do we do this, Ross? We have a little less than a minute left. How do we put this into place given these realities?
So something that we need to accept is that while Democrats were negotiating the last stimulus, they were in a terrible situation. Mitch McConnell is a master hostage taker, and he exacted a terrible price. That said, they really need to do better next time. There is going to be additional legislation to address need to be additional legislation to address the coronavirus crisis. As that happens, we need to do much better at making Democrats use the leverage that they have in order to ensure that a runaway bailout for the fossil fuel industry doesn't happen under existing legislation.